One of the most important things in funk tunes especially is this driving 16th rhythm. And this tune, the 16th note is straight, so it's just your typical 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a division. Try for a moment and just find that division before we start learning on a concert F. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E. And just work it until it sounds really even. And if you're like me, you like to be extra careful with your evenness, so you may even get out a metronome and say work it at tempo. So may start something a little slower. There's 80 beats a minute. Try to keep it really steady. 1, 2, 3, 4. So a lot of the rhythms that we have in funk are going to be divided in this 16th note feel. One of the rhythms is this kind of gallopy rhythm you may find, which sounds like this. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a... something like that. Or you may get this thing I call a reverse gallop, where the two 16th notes appear on the beat. 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E. And then there's this other one where the two 16ths are on the outside and the eighth note is in the middle. That sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1E to 1E to 1E to. It's the one I find people have trouble with the most. And then, of course, there's this other one that's the equivalent to two dotted eighth notes to an eighth note. So it sounds like this. And if you have trouble counting any of these rhythms, what you should do is go back and subdivide it to the 16th note subdivision. So for instance, that last one would be the equivalent to 3 16ths, another 3 16ths plus 2. So it'd sound like this. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2. And you get that nice tight feel when everything is gridded straight up to the 16th note. So when you're learning sections of music, one of the best ways to work them up is to divide and conquer. What I like to do is start slow with the metronome. So if it's marked at 100, I'll take a good portion of that. We'll start like at 70 or something. And I'll just play measure to measure. So I'll play like all of measure 1 here to the first note of measure 2. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1, 2. This is useful because it helps us make sure that our time and our meter is really lined up together. That way every note that starts on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 is played right on those beats. Every note that's played on the end of a beat is played right on those beats, and it's really easy to check that if you take it in small increments. Once again, 1, 2, 3, and 1. So then I'll take the next measure. Again, 3, 4. And all this time I'm constantly subdividing the 16th note in my head really aggressively. Then the third measure there. 1, 2. Notice you see all those rhythms we talked about in the previous segment. 1 and with the tie a lot, and then you also see the 1E duh at the end there, and also in measure 2 1, right? So then once you feel really confident in the tempo, just go ahead and speed it up and see where it's at. Also, a couple notes about my fingering here. Notice the slide isn't necessarily an audible slide. It's really more of a fingering suggestion. The note is still picked, and it almost sounds like there's not a slide there. You don't want to hear the slides in your slides unless it's intentional. So there you go. There's measures 1 through 4. So once again, we want to divide and conquer. We want to start just by playing each measure, maybe even just counting every measure with the metronome slow at about 70. So 1 and 3 and 4 and 1. Once you get that, you can play it. And the next measure, 1 and 3 and 4E. A little different on beat 4 there. Notice it's 4E and not 4N. Then you have the next measure is straight eighth notes until the last beat, and you have another 4E. Then the last measure is a little tricky. You have 1 and 2 and 3 and. And so you'll want to start to put that together and speed it up and just divide and conquer and make sure that everything sounds really tight with the metronome. So now we have some more rhythm playing with some chords. But notice the rhythms are very exact and precise here. They want these first chords played with this really accurate rhythm here. And again, that's that one that's 2 dotted eighth notes essentially. One of those dotted eighth notes is an eighth note tied to a 16th, followed by an eighth note. So the subdivision, if you're thinking 16th notes, which you should be subdividing. You should hear 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 as that division. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And you'll want to try that with a metronome to make sure it's really accurate. We'll start it under tempo at 70 here. So you find the 16th note first, or 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E. That way it's really accurate. Then the same thing down a step. Then and so remember, when you're playing straight eighth notes, like in that third and fourth measure, each of those eighth notes get 2 of those 16 pulses. So you're thinking 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you have another rhythm here in measure, the fifth measure of this section here. You have 1E, da, and 3 and 4. It's a little different. So you have that da 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 da. Ready and again, ready and go. And you want to make sure these notes are really, these chords are really percussive and really clean. You don't want them to be dragging the notes around like this. You don't want to hear the slide. You want to make them sound very staccato. Like, if you practice that at this tempo, by the time you speed it up at tempo, it'll sound much better. That's when it really gets that nice rhythmic feel. It makes it sound like funk. And then you end the whole passage with this little melody line. 1 and 2 and 3, da. So divide and conquer, work up each measure, and put it together with a metronome and make sure it sounds really accurate. So in this next section, they want you to comp, which is short term for compose and accompany, really. So they want you to come up with something using these chords that'll fit this style. So notice the rhythm I have here is something that is pretty typical of things that we've already played. I have this rhythm that sounds like. Notice it's the articulation on it is really precise. There's nothing that's really long. A lot of the notes are really short unless noted otherwise. It's a good rhythm. You could use other rhythms, but this one's pretty good. So this D flat chord I've got, notice if we have a D flat 7, we all know A7, right? So we can play that A7, B flat, B, C, C sharp, D, then there you go. You got E flat 7 there. Okay, so what was that chord? Well, we have a D flat 9 sus. And the trick to those chords is never play the root note on that 9 sus chord. Just think down a whole step and play a major chord. So D flat, down a whole step would be a B natural. So just play a B flat major chord. And to find that shape, what I did is I just think, okay, well here's E major, F, you know, an F chord, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, B flat, then B. And notice how close they are. I'm trying to find chords that are close to each other. And then onto the G flat chord. So you can imagine that one being like out of a D shape. So here's a D chord, E flat, E, F, F sharp, or F sharp. So yeah, G flat. Another thing with my strumming here, sometimes I palm mute the notes kind of lightly and it gives them an extra kind of percussive feel. Another thing I'm being really light with my touch in the left hand and lifting off the notes and playing them really close to the frets. That way I can kind of choke them a little bit too and they respond a little quicker. You hear a lot of good funk players do that. And finally, to end that section, you have this little blues lick. And that should be about it. The best way to practice this kind of thing is just, play along with a track or a 16th note pulse or a metronome, and be sure your 16th subdivisions are really honest and they fit the style. And think about those chord shapes, and so maybe you can find similar ones like that in the future. And now we have the final section here. Some more rhythm playing mixed in with some, some regular linear lines here, lead playing. The rhythms are quite important though. So we get this first measure, 1 E and da, 3 E and da. And resist the urge to play the first chord too long. Make it sound more like that. Second measure, just a variation of the first measure, just with a different rhythm. 1, 2, 3, da. Then you have the same thing as the first measure, up a step, in the third measure. And then I have this comped rhythm that I've written out that sounds appropriate for this section on this B flat 7 chord shape. Then you have this little blues rundown. Then, oops. So yeah, that last little chord section there is a little tricky. You have to move quick, or you'll end up messing up like I did. So the whole thing you get. So there you go, there's the whole funk tune. Now do yourself a favor and play along with a little track that I made out of the drum part and the bass, and see if you can stay real tight with it until you can play just perfectly with it. It's recorded with a metronome, so it'll be really accurate. So if you can play with it, you can play with anything.